So when you're studying for your Unit 4 test, this page, page 95, are some things that you do not want to forget. And so if we start on page 95, it's a good place to start. It's not all-inclusive. You'll still want to go back and read your notes. So I would actually encourage you to read your notes first, and then try to fill this out, and then come back to this video and watch the video again. As we go through this, keep in mind that these are the basic ideas, but that it would be helpful to know a little bit more about it as well. This beginning part is looking at, remember Unit 4 is really about evolution and how populations have changed over generations. A single organism doesn't change, and it doesn't change over time when we look at its genes and its genetics. If we go all the way back to where did life first come from, the theory of abiogenesis is that life came from non-living materials, specifically molecules. So lipids formed and carbs formed and proteins and nucleic acids formed, and then those formed the very first cell. The heterotroph hypothesis is going to explain the evolution of cells. And one thing you might want to add is this P Anna H, the idea of what was the very first cell probably, and you should be able to explain why that first cell especially was anaerobic. As cells reproduced, they accumulated mutations and they became different. And so the heterotroph hypothesis looks at the evolution of cells. We have a different explanation for where eukaryotic cells came from, and this is called the endosymbiont theory. The endosymbiont theory is the idea that small cells started living together, living together, and that's how we got complex cells. If we look at changing so much over time that we eventually get new species, we call that speciation. And that usually happens because of geographic isolation. What is going to cause a new species to develop? Well, usually there's going to be some sort of environmental pressure, and then an adaptation. An adaptation is something an organism can inherit that helps them survive in that environment. So I really encourage you to go back to the bunnies and wolves assignment, look at that and try to explain why is fur color an adaptation. If we look at beak size might be an adaptation, and it would be an example of a structural adaptation, or sometimes we might call it an anatomical adaptation, meaning it's part of the organism's body. But we can also compare DNA and RNA, and that's biochemistry. So biochemistry will compare DNA, RNA, or amino acid sequence to see how related you are. If the anatomical structure has the same structure but a different function, it's called homologous, meaning same structure, and it's actually the sign of a common ancestor. And so what we're seeing here is where did life come from and how does life change over time? But we have to be careful because populations are really what evolve, not individuals. The changes in the DNA can affect the phenotype, and so those mutations don't really happen in a single individual. They accumulate over generations. And so looking at the DNA is really one of the best ways to tell if a species has changed. Environmental changes, so if the environment changes, we might see 3 types or 3 patterns of natural selection, and those are disruptive, stabilizing, and directional. And as those organisms change over time, again, we can end up with speciation, or the development of new species. This most likely happens because of geographic isolation, meaning that the organisms are separated by space and they can't mate anymore. And so they don't exchange genes, they can't mate. They might become so different that they're a new species. If these small changes happen slowly over time, we call it gradualism. But sometimes we have periods of no change, followed by rapid change, and then no change. Versus gradualism would be more like a slope of a line, slowly over time, compared to punctuated equilibrium, no change, quick change, no change. And so the one where there are periods of rapid change is called punctuated equilibrium. So this is where we went to with 4.1. 1 through 15 looked at section 4.1. If we look at section 4.2, what we're really looking at in section 4.2 is the idea that microorganisms, or disease-causing organisms, are really the selection pressures on humans. We're not really affected by temperature, by the availability of food. We don't really have to compete with each other that much. So it's usually pathogens that are actually putting selection pressure on humans and deciding who survives and who doesn't. We do have an adaptation to protect us from that, and that's immunity. We can have passive immunity where we are given the antibodies. Now keep in mind, immunity looks at antibodies. So let's add that word in here. And remember, antibodies are proteins that your body can make. And that's active immunity when your body is making those proteins. And that's an adaptation. You inherit the ability to make those antibodies. And that helps you better survive. Now, passive is not one that you inherit. That's where you are given the antibodies. Keep in mind with active, your body does have to be exposed to the antigen and then it responds. Sometimes we don't have time for your body to respond, or your body's response isn't strong enough. So we will use medicines to help, such as antibiotics. Oh, except this is a problem. We need to read carefully because this talks about a virus's life cycle. So we're not talking about antibiotics, we're actually talking about antivirals. So if you have room to draw a line through it, it'll help you remember antivirals and antibiotics are not the same thing. Antivirals interfere with viruses, antibiotics interfere with bacteria. So if we look at is evolution occurring today, the two examples that we looked at were antibiotic resistance, how some bacteria have a random mutation, and those are the ones that will survive. The antibiotic doesn't cause the mutation, the bacteria already have it. The other example were pesticide resistance, where we saw that some pests were actually born as mutants, and they were able to survive pesticide. And so 4.2 looks at how pathogens can evolve and be examples of natural selection. When we look at giving names to organisms, when we understand that there has been a tremendous variety in life, and we want to give an organism a name, we want to recognize all the different living things. This section 20 to 25 is 4.3. When we give an organism a name, we give it a general name, its genus, and a specific name, its species name. And this is known as binomial nomenclature. And this is the scientific name. And so remember, you need to capitalize the first word, lowercase the second, and underline the whole word. And the genus is supposed to show an evolutionary relationship. So if you're the same genus, like Canis lupus and Canis familiaris, that should mean that you're related. We do break life up into three main domains. Eukarya, which are eukaryotes, bacteria, and archaea bacteria. And we'll look at these a little bit more later, but we do want to know that domain is one of the levels of classification. If I'm going to group species and give them their species name, they need to be able to breed and produce fertile offspring, meaning the offspring can also breed. When I'm going to classify organisms, I'm going to use their anatomy. I'm going to look at their physical characteristics. I'm going to look at their biochemistry, their DNA, and I'm going to look at how they develop, or their embryology. And if I want to see how they are related, if I want to check myself and make sure that I gave names to show evolution, I'm going to do something called phylogeny. I'm going to create a phylogenetic tree, and that phylogenetic tree should show me how organisms are related. If I know an organism and I just want to find its name, I use a dichotomous key. And so this is a review of the assignments actually on page 96 that you need to know. This is kind of a quick review of the notes. It's not all inclusive. What I want to do is just spend a few seconds going back to your apps and looking at some of the important questions in your apps. If we look at 4.3, you definitely need to know the two parts of a scientific name. So go back to your notes and make sure when we mean two parts, we mean two taxa. So, for example, Homo sapien. Sapien is the species name. What do I call the homo part? What is that? That is not the species name, but something else. When we look at the rest of this, I do want to make sure that you get a chance. Please make sure that you have answered 6 through 8 about phylogenetic trees. If we go back to page 83, 83 are the apps or the homework that goes along with your evolution. Definitely make sure that you go back and look at number 1, what were the conditions of the early atmosphere, and number 2, be careful. For a lot of you, I told you, you might want to explain this a little more. Not just say that it talks about evolution of cells, but explain how cells have evolved. You should definitely be able to do number 3 and 4. These are really important opportunities to review the different types of evidence. Definitely make sure that you do 9 and 10. We started these in class, so hopefully you finished them. And then if we go to your apps for 4.2, important questions here are going to include number 4 and number 5, so making sure that you went back. Hopefully you're going to go back and read your notes, look through those notes and see what's important for you to study. Basically, all of it. Good luck on your test.